Good morning, folks. Thanks for joining us. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes as everyone arrives, after most people arrive. Morning, everyone. All right, we will wait one more minute and then the stragglers will have to catch up with us. Okay. Well, good morning, folks. Thank you for taking some time this morning to join us at this webinar. My name is Evan Manvell. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a climate mitigation planner here at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. Worked on these rules with the rules team, who you are all probably familiar with. Cody Meyer and Kevin Young are with us as well as some regional representatives and other good folks. But we've got a lot to get through, so I will not dawdle a lot on introductions. This webinar is mainly trying to help folks understand the parking rules in the climate-friendly equitable communities rules that were adopted by the Commission in July. Kind of flag for us as a department where folks have a lot of questions, and maybe we can publish some guidance and help people out. If there are areas that aren't going to work, or we might want to tweak the rules a little bit, the Commission has directed us to be alert for those and be listening for those in case we do need to adjust the rules a little bit. It's mainly focused at local government practitioners who are working to bring these into their local codes, and but you all are welcome. I'm thrilled you all are here. As we go through, we're gonna check for questions kind of at the end of each rule, which is kind of each section. Like 405 is a rule and 410 is a rule and that sort of thing. Feel free to raise your hand or chat a question. Cody will try to line those up. This is being recorded, so we may not get through it all. I didn't want to schedule a 2-hour webinar, so if we need to come back and do another webinar, that's possible. I'm also happy to stay on the line for a while or answer questions outside of this as well. So with that, okay, I'm seeing a question about registration being closed. I apologize. It's possible that we're bumped up against the 100-person limit for registrations, but Cody's trying to work it out, so I apologize. This will be recorded and shareable afterwards. Okay. So here's kind of the outline of the next hour and a half. So feel free to wander away if it's not an interest of you and come back. The most important thing we want to make sure we cover is the stuff that's due at the end of this year, at the end of December. So the 430 and 440 for the end. So that 935 thing is kind of a time certain. We'll get to what we can before that 935 and then spend as much time as we need in 935 and cover the other stuff after that. Yeah, so we're going to talk about who the rules apply to, kind of some key timing things, understanding where to find what you're curious about in the parking rules, and then talk about the various rules. So that's kind of the overlay of the webinar. Yeah. Okay. So the parking reform rules the commission adopted apply in Oregon's 8 metro areas, not those areas that are adjacent to the Washington MPOs, Rainier and Milton Freewater, but the 8 that are fully in Oregon, as well as 3 counties. So if you are not in those areas, these rules do not impact your jurisdiction. The county stuff is a little tricky in the sense that there are some counties that have a bunch of people who live in the urban growth boundary but are outside city limits, because we wrote it so the area is served by urban water and sanitary services. So there were some questions about, for example, Lane County or possibly Deschutes County. I don't remember exactly who, but we think it's probably just applying to these 3 counties, Clackamas, Washington, and Marion, that have a large number of people in urban style development and or just happen to not be in a city limit, but are in that 8 MPOs. The other thing I would flag for those listening in is if you are a small city, that is a city with a population of less than 10,000, there are criteria for you to ask for an exception. So this is the OIR to look at 660, 12, 100. So you may be able to make the case that you should be accepted from these rules. But that's who this applies to. Any questions about any of that before we keep moving? Okay, I'm not seeing questions. Fabulous. Pretty clear. So the parking timing has a couple of 3 different phases, and then a couple of things that you just want to square up as you're doing those other parts of the rules. The first thing is at the end of this year, there are a couple of provisions about just saying, hey, cities and counties aren't going to mandate parking near frequent transit and for certain use types, and they're not going to mandate more than 1 unit per 1 space per unit for multifamily development. That doesn't actually require code changes. You can apply the state standards directly, or you can adopt that into your code. At the end of March, the EV charging requirements come in, and we'll get to those. And by next June, at the end of next June, we're kind of asking cities and counties to have made some decisions and implement changes into their codes. You can ask for an alternative date. Hopefully you all are aware of that, but you can make the case that, hey, that's not going to work for you for various reasons, and talk to us about it. So that's a date that's less firm in the rules. The other 2 things, when communities actually adopt their climate-friendly areas, they should comply with the parking rules for that. And when you're updating a transportation system plan and have identified official priority transit corridors, you just want to double check that those comply with the parking reforms. They probably will, but that's just last little bit. Any questions about any of that? Okay.
Hey, Evan.
Yeah.
This is Peter Hurley with the City of Portland.
Of course.
Will you be going deeper on the June 30th, 2023, the 3 reform approaches?
Yeah, I'm going to be going into each of these bits deeper as we go. I just wanted to start with an overall timing question, and so yeah, hopefully we'll answer your question when we get to that.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Peter. So one of the confusions that people have with the parking reforms is, hey, does this just apply near frequent transit or near climate friendly areas, or is this citywide? And the answer is both. So it's been kind of confusing. It's kind of nice to have this visual, for example, from Gresham, where, okay, some of these reforms happen in a geographic area. Others are certain uses that are outside of those areas. So you can kind of see the town centers in the purple lines and the areas near those. And then the darker green is the area well served by transit. And then there's some multifamily use outside of that that get reformed. And some reforms happen citywide. So it's confusing. I understand that. But we'll walk through that some more on how that all works. So just to be clear, some of these reforms are city or countywide within the UTB. Okay. So the rules, we realize the rules are a lot. The climate friendly area, the CFEC rules, where to find things. So most of parking reform is contained in the 400 series, OAR 660, 12, 400 through 450. There are a couple of things that are helpful to know. The definitions for all the rules are up in 005, and then there's applicability and deadlines in 0012, 0012, so 1212. So that's where you might be able to find stuff if you're looking for it. The parking reform section is split into kind of two sections. The first section is, hey, these are reforms everyone's going to do, and then there's a break at 420, and it says, hey, if you don't have parking mandates, you don't have to do anything else in this. So, and then if you do have parking mandates, you get to the 425s through the 450s. So that's kind of how it's structured. These slides will be available afterwards, but we do just want to mentally, that's how it's in those two big chunks. So any questions about that? Okay. Getting to the definitions, a couple of things we want to highlight. There are these things defined in the definitions. The first is that we use the term parking mandates to talk about what planners traditionally call minimum parking requirements. But we kind of define what it is there. The second thing is we define a parking space and exclude in that definition of parking space the parking spaces reserved for carpools, vanpools, and ADA parking. So cities and counties can require, these don't impact cities and counties requiring ADA parking, carpools, and vanpools. So it's kind of a way we did it, has its pluses and minuses, but we do want to highlight that's where we do that policy decision. Any questions about that? Okay. Oh, Sandy.
Yeah, so just a question on the ADA. Typically, we require the number of ADA spaces dependent on the total number of parking provided. We don't, as far as I know, and I'm not real versed in our updated code, but I'm not sure that we require any ADA outside of that locally. So just understanding how that ties into what you were just talking about. So it's only if we require it locally beyond as a number of total that we would be able to continue to require those.
That's correct under state law, Sandy. The state building codes ADA spaces are based off the number of spaces provided in the parking lot. And most local regulations follow the state rules rather than having their own extra ADA requirements.
And Sandy, so what some communities that have reformed parking do across the country is they rely on their parking table, and they say we're not going to enforce the non-ADA spaces, but we're going to enforce the ADA based off that parking table. So there are a couple of different options there, and I'm happy to share that code from the city of Austin, for example, that takes that latter approach. But yeah, so certainly this is an ongoing conversation I'm having with disability advocates and disability professionals to try to get some real clarity on the best approach here. But yeah, ADA is about equal access. So if you're providing parking, you provide additional parking. Yeah, so folks, I am sorry that I think that we ended up using a license here that capped at 100. So there were 100 that we were bumping up close to that 100 registrants, and it looks like maybe we hit that 100 registrants. So even though there aren't 100 people in the room, that was what we did. So my apologies. I'm happy. Yeah, we'll have the recording and we'll have additional opportunities to engage in this. If we need to redo it, we can redo it. So unless Cody can provide magic. But yeah, so so that is an issue, Sandy, that I think we'll probably be putting guidance out on, because we do very much think certain people with disabilities need parking, and that's an equity issue. So we're working on addressing that, working on providing some guidance on that. Thank you for flagging that. Okay. Okay. So moving on. Apologies that this is so popular. I'm thrilled, but I apologize. Oh, and Cody's trying to create magic. Thank you, Cody. So 405. So let's get into some of the meat here. If there aren't any other questions about definitions. So I'm just going to be throwing up the language here and saying a few words about it and taking questions. Some of what's in 405 is in the previous transportation planning rule language. So we carried some of that forward and we added to it. There's designated parking for carpools and vanpools. There's ability to redevelop for biking and transit oriented facilities now, not just transit oriented. And there's some clarity that as those redevelopments happen, you can go below the mandated minimum while retaining access for emergency vehicles and thinking about truck loading. 2 and 3 here are pretty broad and flexible. There are a lot of good examples of cities and counties making it easier to convert unused both on-street and off-street parking areas to other uses. We'll be providing some examples of some good policies to do that, but it's a pretty broad language there. 3 about shared parking. There are ways to make, certainly there are examples in a lot of your codes that allow shared parking. There are ways to make them stronger and better. And I imagine we've been writing some guidance about that, just thinking about, hey, let's presume that multiple uses can share parking instead of requiring a lot of hoops to jump through, with kind of a negative presumption that it's possible, but kind of a positive presumption that it's possible. So we'll provide some examples there, but as a legal matter, those aren't super strong requirements. Let's see. Before I get on to the next one, any questions about these?
So Jason has a question for you, Evan.
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, just a quick question. I just wanted to double check. 405 applies to the cities regardless of whether they remove vehicle parking minimums or not, correct?
That is correct. So 405 through 415 apply regardless.
Great, thanks.
Yep. Okay, 405.4 is talking about big parking lots going forward, and saying there was a provision in the old TPR about super large parking lots. This is quarter acre and larger parking lots. and it provides options for those developments in those parking lots. Solar, which doesn't have to be over the parking lot, it can be anywhere on the property. A fee in lieu, or tree canopy. Tree canopy is something that some cities have done. The city of Coburg, for example, a lot of California cities. It's really trying to take, yeah, some of the impacts of large parking lots and deal with those impacts. So, and there are examples of requiring trees near driveways from codes that we are going to provide some potential code language for. Sub C here, there was a version of that in the TPR previously. Coordinate tree canopy with utilities, that's kind of pretty straightforward. And this just trying to make sure those trees live. And because it can be a hostile environment, so making sure that the trees are developed in a way that they'll be there. And the last thing is, oh, there we go. Thank you, Cody. So we got a live stream, and Cody's probably, I don't know if you can chat the live stream link, or that would be great. Appreciate that. And then a kind of vague shall establish parking maximums in appropriate locations from the previous TPR. Any questions about the second half of 405, the tree canopy and other provisions? Okay, now that we're live around the world, people are shy. No, we're good. All right, well, hearing none. 410 is the electric vehicle conduit rules. And this only applies to cities. This doesn't apply to counties. That was a decision the state legislature made. So this is just extending what the state legislature said, is that land use folks can change the percentage of spaces that are required to have this conduit. And so you all should be implementing the new 20% conduit requirement. That's something the building codes and the state legislature implemented as of July 1st this year. And they are, I've talked to them, they said they're not getting a lot of questions about this. I don't know if you all are getting a lot of questions about that, if you all are implementing it or struggling with it. Any insight you have or any help we can provide, I'm happy to work with building codes to provide that. But this rule is just about residential units or mixed use units with 5 or more residential. That's where most people charge, and that's where we thought we could do a little bit more on EVs. So okay. Any questions about the EV conduit provisions? Or any stories that it's working or not working as you're implementing it currently? It's building, okay. Yeah, so this is after March 31st next year that the 40% provision is required. Oh, one last thing about this. You can put this in your development code. We think that's probably best for ease of use. But again, you can apply the state standard directly if you don't want it in your codes. Okay, the parking maximums in 415. This only applies to the cities in bold, cities and counties in bold. So it's pretty much Washington, Clackamas County, and then cities over the 6 or 7 cities over 100,000, and metro area cities over 25,000. And it's locational. It's in climate-friendly areas or the metro equivalent, and along the transit corridors and rail stop areas in 440. So the parking maximums, you all can read the language yourself. There's a parking maximum for studios and non-studios. They're not super tight, but that's what they are. And then there's some uses. Looking at the parking codes, there were certain uses that have a lot of parking, and we didn't, really go after the eating, drinking establishments and entertainment, commercial, recreation, and auto sales and repair. So the other uses, we set a limit there, and then for super large uses, just followed kind of the city of Gresham's lead on their parking maximum requirements. So it's inartfully drafted, but it is what it is. It's just looking at those specific areas. Brian.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to clarify, the parking maximums are only in climate friendly areas or citywide?
So they are in climate friendly areas, or if you're in your metro regional town centers, and in those transit corridors and rail stop areas. So the transit corridors are a half mile around frequent transit, and the rail stop areas. So it's not citywide, it's just in these areas. That's this provision. There was that kind of vague provision in 405 that yeah, here we go. So this is kind of a vague, you should have parking maximums in appropriate locations. So maybe that's just redundant with the climate friendly areas and the transit corridors. But this also applies to the less population cities. So, okay. Other questions? Okay. Yeah.
Well, Evan, I do have a question that someone sent me privately that I am not able to answer. So they're asking, did they hear correctly that building codes division already implemented the rule this summer that would require a lower percentage of EV spaces?
Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
They were saying that then the percentage would jump to a higher number next March. That's the question?
That's correct. The state legislature directed the building codes division to have a 20% requirement in new commercial parking lots, as well as multifamily and multi-use. We and set it at the 20%. So but the legislature said by a process using land use, you can use a higher percentage. And we tried to do a more nuanced approach, but the state legislature kind of prescribe, like depending on the level of charger, but the state legislative direction kind of limited that. So we just could mess with the percentage, and we said 40% for new development was kind of future proofing us for what we think is the coming EV revolution. I don't know if people have seen in the news that DEQ has talked about following the Washington and California examples and limiting the sales of gas vehicles after 2035. So
and I see that Kevin is waiting to jump in here.
Not on this topic, but I just thought I'd flag that we have a question in the chat from John Russell. Is EV conduit required for on-street parking in any situation?
I can't think of that. Let me noodle on that a little bit. Like there's this kind of, but I don't think a reading of the rule would require that. So my guess is no, but I will think about that some more and write down to get back to you on that.
Thanks, Evan.
Okay. Anything? Awesome. Okay. So we're through 4:15 and we're staying on time. Well done. So just conceptually taking a step back, once again, the parking reforms were set up as 3 options. The first is no mandates, and then you're done with your parking work under the rules. The second and third are 2 options where you retain mandates, and do various things. Option 2, we kind of call fair parking policies because it emphasizes the policies. Option 3, we call reduced regulation because that's just cutting some of the regulations in more areas and more types. There's a little bit of a jumping back and forth in time for the 430s and the 440s, where you're repealing some of the mandates for things. It's possible that you would implement 430 and 440 and then come back and say, oh, we chose an option 1, and then you can kind of like not worry about the 430 and the 440 anymore, because you have additional time to make this decision. We do understand that it may be a multi-step decision, that you get a taste of parking reform under 440 and 430, and you say that's okay, we can live with that, and then not worry about it. Okay. So that's a conceptual overview of the rest of the parking reform. Okay. So let's talk about 430 and then 440. For both of these, the rules are clear that cities and counties shall implement, and that's a specific term, the requirements of these when reviewing development applications submitted after the end of the year. So that's specifically not saying you have to adopt your code changes. You just implement the requirements. You can implement the state requirements directly, or you can change your codes. So 430 starts with where it applies, and we've talked about that. And then section 2, it says, okay, we're not going to require more than 1 parking space per unit in residential developments with more than 1 dwelling unit on a single property. Pretty straightforward, in line with what we've been, the various parking reforms that have come through with the traditional middle housing. Section 3 talks about a variety of development types that are kind of generally equity uses, and repealing the parking mandates there. We think a lot of these developments will probably provide some parking, but we don't want to mandate it. So the first is facilities and homes for people with disabilities, roughly. And then the rest are childcare, SROs, small residential units. And sub D here, that's freestanding or in a multi-unit development. That's how we read that. Sub 3, affordable housing. Sub 5, public supported housing, and then shelters, both for those experiencing homeless and domestic violence shelters. Any questions about 430? Because it is one of the ones that's coming up soon, in a few months.
Evan, this is Peter with the City of Portland.
Yeah.
Why did you choose 750 square feet? Now, I'll give you a bit of context. You may be aware that the City of Portland has an ADU maximum size of 800 square feet, and there are ADUs that are built that are 775 or 800 square feet. How'd you come up with 750?
Well, ADUs can't require parking anyway, but we came per state law, for what the state legislature did. We came up with 750, kind of looking at studios and somewhat bedrooms, is what we generally thought would come in at that levels, and those are kind of the sorts of uses that are likely to have fewer vehicles per place and serve lower income folks somewhat, thinking about micro housing and some other things as well. So it was it was a decision we made. We didn't have a lot of people pushing that number one way or another after we set it out in draft probably 10 months ago now. But that's a little history on that. So I
And when you
realize it.
say-
Go ahead.
And when you say ADUs can't require parking, are you talking about City of Portland, or is there something in the parking rules?
That's state law. It's or as Kevin, am I correct?
I'm sorry, Evan, I was typing something into the chat. What was the question?
ADUs can't require parking, right? Per state law.
Oh, I believe that is correct with the latest. I'll research it and get back to you. Okay.
Awesome.
Yep.
It's good to know, and you might want to consider adding that to the slideshow for future parking reform, just so everybody's aware.
Yeah, no, we certainly every now and again run up a city code where they're still requiring it, or they haven't updated their code, and so it would be good to flag it for folks.
Great, thanks for the answer on that.
Sure. Okay, any other questions about 7:30? Yeah, and I apologize. A lot of this, as we're just going through what the rules are, there's not a lot of the whys there. But we talked about the whys a fair amount. So, but we just want to make sure people understand the rule language and how we're reading it. Christina.
I have a question on the, if you go back to the prior slide. No, sorry, maybe it was the next slide forward. I have a question on measuring the distance from transit corridors.
Oh yeah, that's where we are. So
Okay.
Yeah, 440. What's your question?
So not clear what it means to use either walking distance or straight line distance. In terms of, I sent this question to our GIS folks, and so they sent back, we have routes that split. So the route goes one way on one street and another way down another street. Are we measuring from just stop locations? Are we measuring from edge of curb of those right of way? We're measuring edge of right of way. What does it mean? Essentially that within 1/2 mile of a frequent transit corridor.
Yeah. We've talked and internally about what the data are easily available, and usually the center line of the road is what's most easily available. And I think that's a decent good faith implementation of this. We're talking a few feet from this, center line or curb. So I don't think we would have heartache using the center line.
If we used distance from stops to actually get on the route, would that be considered walking distance, or is it from the walking distance from the center line of the road?
Yeah, so thank you, Christina. So there are two different parts here. Section 2 talks about stops explicitly, and Section 3 talks about the corridor. So the corridor we read as being the road, being the center line of the road itself, not a stop. Because it's different language, we think it's the corridor, not the stop.
I'm talking about subsection 4.
Yeah. So if the question's so we think for the non-rail stops, it's about the corridor or the road. It's not to a stop directly, because Section 2 is about the stop.
So it would be walking distance to get to the corridor.
Can I jump in here, Evan?
Yeah. Yes.
So section 4, when you're looking at walking distance or straight line distance, that is really just a flexibility to say how your GIS folks measure it. So we are fine with a circle. You just say, okay, a 1/4 mile and or a 1/2 mile, whatever the rule says, and do a circle. And that's, a straight line distance, right? That's a very coarse grain. Some cities have an advanced pedestrian network to do the road network. And so a 1/4 mile is as the road network goes. And so it wouldn't be a perfect circle. It would be kind of a weird, lumpy polygon. And so that section 4 is really just flagging intention, we're agnostic as to how folks want to measure that you can do the simple buffer analysis that any GIS student coming out of college could do. Or you have advanced data and you want to get into like a little bit more fine-grained analysis there. So we're okay in just meeting folks where they're at with their their capabilities and their data they have on hand.
And so my question is about where you're measuring the walking distance. If you do the walking distance measurement, where are you doing that walking? Like, is it walking distance to get onto the route, which means it's walking distance from a stop, or is it walking distance to the corridor? And so you're measuring that walking distance from the continuous road center line.
And that's what I was saying, in section 2, you're looking at stops. In section 3, you're looking at the corridor. And you can measure both of those either in a rudimentary buffer analysis, which is a straight line distance. You just go out, half mile or 3/4 of a mile. Or you have a more nuanced data set and you want to do more advanced operations to look at like really where people can access, or there barriers in the way. So it really is 2 different things going on here. There's the style of the way you're going to measure, and then there's section 2 and 3 is what you're measuring from. So stops in 2, corridor in 3.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Cody. Jason.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, if I understand 3 correctly here on the frequent transit corridors, it's also pulling in the lot or parcel where the development occurs. So is it logical to say any lot or parcel boundary that's within that distance to however you buffer the corridor? Is that the real measurement we're talking about?
That's my reading of the language, Jason. Yeah, we were very much trying to figure out like, okay, is the building located on a certain place, or like where? I was like, okay, the easiest thing to do is to say the property line is within that line.
So the walking distance doesn't inform it too much if you just go off of the parcel boundary, is that right?
Cody, do you have a thought on that?
I'm sorry, I was responding to someone in chat. So what was the question again? Apologize.
I was just wondering whether the walking distance provision really adds much to the conversation or the analysis, if it's sufficient just to measure the distance from any lot or parcel boundary to whatever corridor you've defined in your GIS analysis.
It really depends on the quality of the data that you have. If you're just using streets as your walking distance, then you're probably undercutting a lot of pedestrian paths that might not be showing up on your street data network. But if you do have that advanced pedestrian network, I know TriMet has done a lot of work and has like really good pedestrian analysis of their network. So it just really comes down to what's the quality of the data you're starting with. And are you really looking at it's all trade-offs when you're doing this kind of GIS analysis, really. So I find that I'm a fan of just the circles. I think that those do pretty good, and people are pretty ingenious in finding shortcuts through parking lots and holes and fences and stuff that never shows up on data set. So I would personally prefer to overestimate on just using the simple.
I see Kelly has her hand up. I also see a question. Sorry, did that answer your question, Jason? We can continue to talk about this.
Yep, that sounds good.
Okay. So to be clear, before I get to your hand, Kelly, so reading section 3 here, 3A doesn't apply yet because no one's designated a priority transit corridor. No one's updated their transportation system plan since these rules went into effect. But when they do, that's when that will come into effect. Sub B here is about 4 times an hour during peak service. And sub C is if you don't have anything that applies under sub B, the most frequent transit route or route in the community, routes in the community. If you've got at least once per hour during peak service. So that's kind of the Venn diagram of how that fits together. So Kelly.
Thanks, Evan. I think my question is probably the same as John's in the chat. So hopefully this will answer his as well. I got a question from City of Fairview about, so they have 2 transit lines, and neither comes at 4 per hour. So one comes every 34 minutes, one comes every 22 minutes or thereabouts. So they're going to fall under letter C, 3C. And I'm just confirming that this is correct with an example. So the line, they have line 21 that comes 34 minutes per hour and line 77 that comes every 22 minutes. So would they be just identifying the most frequent one, which would be line 77? Or, would we be looking at both of them for any reason?
No, I think most frequent is probably singular in most communities. It's for communities that have various routes that are the most frequent that run the same frequency, then it would apply to multiple routes. But in what I'm hearing from you, it would be the one that comes more frequently. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
We have 2 more hands up and a question in the chat, going back to the center line and the corridor and transit routes. So maybe we'll just take this one on the chat first, Evan. So Sarah Hackett's asking if there's a corridor that has a bus stop, but the bus stops are like a mile away from each other. Would a store that's located a mile away from the bus stop, but still located in the catchment of the corridor, have no parking mandate?
Yeah, there would be no, like, I can't think of a, well, if it's in the corridor, yes, there would be no parking mandate there. It's very rare to have bus stops a mile apart.
Okay,
but
we have that's Joseph masquerading as Sarah, so I'll rename you.
But yeah, if that's the sort of situation that you think we should consider a rule clarification, like in all of these things, if there's something that you feel isn't working or doesn't make any sense and want to suggest a rule amendment, that's fine. We've certainly had a lot of technical work groups on these rules and looked over them for many months and redrafted them for many months, but the door is not closed. So yeah, just because we've adopted rules doesn't mean anyway. Okay, Jen.
Jen and then Sandy, Evan.
Hi, I work for ODOT for the Transportation Planning Analysis Unit. So we do modeling. You guys can hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. We have activity-based model for the Southern Oregon area. Right now, we do transit, multimodal. The transit, we use the stops or stations for accessibility instead of using corridor. Because I was thinking about your section 3 about the, because think about metro, the max light rail. So if a half mile as a kind of accessibility to the corridor, then some stops are like a few miles away. Then you can, but they are distances to the corridor is half mile. So you just don't give them, enforcement parking mandates. I'm just wondering about how do you implement that? Any area within the half mile corridor to the corridor of max is do not follow this enforcement mandates or something?
Yeah, so max falls under section 2. There's nothing in section 3 that would apply to max light rail, and other than if people identified it under 3A. So yeah, 3B is about bus service and 3C is about most frequent, at least once per hour. So max falls under 3B. So it's yeah, so certainly understand that back and forth between corridor and stop, and we tried to write around it, but happy to talk about this with you offline if you think we need to adjust it a little bit. But yeah,
Okay.
thank you. Sandy.
Yeah, I'm confused in terms of 3B and 3C. I thought I heard you say it's an or, but I'm seeing it as an and so
Yeah.
how do these work together?
Yeah, so thanks, Sandy. So our attorneys don't allow us to write and or, and or would be kind of anyway. So if you have service under 3B that comes at least 4 times an hour during peak service, it is among the most frequent transit routes in your community. So 3C would just be redundant there because you've already, the most frequent transit routes in your community. Oh, that's what we did in 3B. So we've already done that. So that's the effort there. So if you get anything under 3B, you've already done 3C and you don't have to do additional work under 3C. So the and is somewhat a legal drafting issue. And given the level of confusion, my desire to be concise, maybe I should have overridden that and in 3C said, if no actions under B, then, but that was the decision. So if you do 3A and 3B or 3B now and then 3A when you update your transportation system plan, you don't have to worry about 3C. So because the most frequent is already in those other buckets. So if you have nothing that applies under 3B, then 3C is your path. So I understand there's a different way it could have been drafted that may have been cleaner for readers. I apologize for that, but does that make sense?
Yes, thank you for the explanation.
Yeah.
One more in the chat here from Eric.
Yeah.
Portland.
Yeah, so is 4:15. Okay.
We want to read it, Evan, just for folks on YouTube or whatever can.
Yep.
I don't think they can see the chat. So is the 0415A requirement for setting maximum within the transit corridors and rail stop areas listed in OAR 660-012-0440, referring to the priority transit corridors or others or all of the 0440 sub 3 A, B, and C? Does this still apply if the 0440 mandates don't apply if we remove mandates, for example? That is, the geographic boundaries apply to the 0415 requirements, but not the 0440 requirements. And thank you, Eric, for making me read that whole thing.
Yes. That's the answer. No, I'm kidding. So I need to kind of see if I can juggle my screens here and have this whole question. Okay. So 415 sub A, transit corridors and rail stop areas listed in the whole rule 440 applies to everything in 440. So it's the rail stops, it's the any of these corridors as well. So that's what it applies to. We didn't say 440 sub 3A. We said 440. So that the parking maximum should apply to all this stuff, all the areas that you're removing mandates for in these areas. So does 415 still apply? Yes, 415 still applies because that's the identified frequent transit corridor. Yeah, or rail stop. So I think that's clear. If not, happy to talk about it some more, or happy to have you ask your question verbally or chat some more back. Yeah, and Joseph, we are aware that there are some agencies that use different measurements than the half mile and 3/4 mile. We think that the literature is clear that people will walk a half mile to frequent transit. So, or more for higher quality transit. So that was the decision we made.
So Evan, maybe I'll just hop in real quick to make sure. I think that helped clarify, but I think, and thanks for clarifying, it's not just the sub 3, but it's wherever those areas that would have had mandates applied, you're fundamentally in 415 still saying great, but apply the maximums, for the cities where that applies, Portland, and a few others. But so, which makes sense, I think, conceptually, right? That even if you're removing the mandates, you still want to be using the maximums, because that's another strategy that continues to push down parking supply. And so I just wanted to clarify that, since it's a little funny where these are stipulated here, but you define the geographies in 440, but they still apply in terms of what the 415 requirements are to all of those geographies. Fundamentally, the structure.
Yep, that
Okay.
We're seeing eye to eye. Yep. Okay. Other questions here? We're happy to spend more time on this because this is coming up at the end of the year. Okay. One last thing I would say here is we're continuing our talks with some transit folks and providers. We've published guidance on this. It is possible we will revise that guidance. All the guidance that we publish is possible that we'll revise it as we hear more and we learn more. But there is guidance on our webpage right now on 440 because we have been getting a lot of questions about it. And so we may change it a little bit or clarify it a little bit based on these conversations, because we all want to provide you the best information possible. Anything else on that? Okay, fabulous. Nope, almost got it. Oh, there you go. Thanks, Cody, for sharing the link to the guidance webpage. So now we're into the world of, well, 430 and 440 happen soon. 425 is another piece that comes in. Cities and counties are directed to do this by next June, the end of next June. Amend, adopt, and enforce land use regulations per these. Most of these are based on kind of best practices from codes around Oregon, or hurdles that people have come up against. So that's what they are. And the image of a ping pong paddle is because 1A is kind of, you can't require ping pong rooms. Garages are often not used for car storage. You all know that. Possibly a majority of the time. They're often used for ping pong rooms. I love ping pong. I have nothing against ping pong, but the city shouldn't be requiring everyone to have a ping pong room. So that's the image. These are pretty straightforward. Garages, carports can't be mandated. If people do have a garage parking space, that you should count that towards the parking mandates. Sometimes folks pretend that the garage is not designated or designed for that. 1C, make sure that shared parking is in there. It's maybe a little bit redundant with the shared parking stuff, but we want to be really explicit that shared parking is part of the mix. 1D is allowing some parking spaces to be provided off-site. The 2,000 feet pedestrian travel is, I think, the city of Salem's code, and we kind of think is a reasonable standard. But if you're providing some on-site, the parking for people with disabilities should be on-site. And if you're providing parking off-site, make the parking for people with disabilities within a reasonable distance. So the last 1E is just kind of leaning into that. These are rules in part to reduce climate pollution. And if people are putting in solar or wind, they can get some reductions on mandates, parking mandates. Again, car sharing you get some credits on your parking mandates. EV charging, you get some credits for that. And homes that are fully accessible to people with mobility disabilities. There's a real shortage of housing that's fully accessible for people. We can't generally do a lot on that. That's building codes world. But this is a little way that our parking rules nod towards that underserved demand. So hopefully reducing the cost of parking will allow people to build more accessible housing. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. Cumulative those reductions. And then if you're still in this world of mandating parking, multifamily residential units in the areas near transit, near the frequent transit in 440 shall be unbundled parking. And we're going to talk about that a little bit now. Any questions about any of the provisions before I talk about unbundled parking? Okay, fabulous. Unbundled parking is renting or selling the parking spaces separate from the unit for either housing or commercial. And we define it in our definitions. And a fair number of cities in the US have done this, both north and south of us. We're not aware of anyone in Oregon doing it yet. But it's best practice. It really does tend to change behavior when people get a financial incentive for not having a car. It's kind of a nudge where people have to pay for their parking that they consume, and then people think about how many cars they own and how much they want to own those cars. So there is sample language that's been put in the land use codes in California and Washington. We're gonna share that language with you all. Probably within the next month, we'll have something out there for you. As far as enforcement of unbundled parking, when we've talked to these cities, they said it's a complaint-based enforcement. So if a resident is not getting, forced to pay for parking spaces they're not using, they can complain to the city, and then the code enforcement officer can check in and resolve the situation. So that's unbundled parking, and it comes up again in the rules. So are there questions about unbundled parking?
Evan, can we just clarify, unbundled parking is an optional provision that cities could use and not in the rules as a requirement, is that correct?
So the unbundled parking only comes in after 420. So those cities that choose to repeal their parking mandates don't have to do anything about unbundled parking. If you do continue to retain both under options C and B, there are certain ways that unbundled parking comes in. Is that clear? Okay?
Questions in the chat here. So Kelly's asking, would the unbundled provision apply to existing development or just new development that comes in?
Yeah. So as the rule's written, it applies to existing and new development. Certainly imagine that cities would likely adopt something for new leases. And I think that would be within the spirit of the rules, not requiring, but that's how the city of Seattle does it when the lease is re-signed. Yeah.
And then Eric is asking, so is this just residential and not commercial? And then commercial has kind of an equivalent called parking cash out.
So there is so commercial parking cash. So I wouldn't quite frame it that way, Eric. The rule in 425 is just for multifamily residential. There's some stuff in 445 that touches on commercial. And then, and also touches on parking cash out, which is a little bit separate of an issue in the way I mentally frame it. And so that parking, that unbundled parking is for ongoing monthly leases. Parking cash out is for an individual employee and their choices. So it's not the actual person renting or leasing or buying the property. It's separate from that. So
I have one more question. Okay. Another question from Christina, who asks, will DLCD be providing formal guidance interpreting the rule to say cities comply with this rule if they use a complaint-based enforcement mechanism?
So none of our guidance has legal weight, or sorry, none of our guidance is law. It's not rule, it's not statute, as you know, Christina. But I just want to be clear for everyone. It's something that you could use as, hey, this is the advice we got, and so we shouldn't get in trouble. And so I think that I'm inclined to do that, Christina, but I'll talk internally. And so the short answer is likely yes, as much as it's worth, which is it's worth a little bit, but it's not. Yeah. I mean, it's if you have the requirement on your books and you don't have the resources to enforce it, but you respond to complaints, and that feels within the spirit of what we were aiming for. But I'll talk internally with our folks, and we'll let you know. Sorry, writing that down. I know that this chat will be captured, but also want to be clear that that's a desire to hear that. Okay, fabulous. So yes, okay. So we know you all need some more guidance on this. It's something that we've been planning to provide guidance on, and we will give you some guidance on the unbundled parking issue. So just again, the three reforms. Fair pricing still includes some types in some areas, like that stuff near transit, and the equity types, and adopt the fair parking policies. And option 3 is more types of developments and in more areas. Okay. So 445. So 445 again sets up and reminds people of option, the first option of no mandates. In lieu of doing that, cities do one of the other two things. And then sub 2 says, or section 2 says, cities and counties may change their selection between. So if you choose fair policies and you don't like them, and you go to part B, or or you can choose to repeal all your mandates, and so you can kind of move between the three. I think that's pretty clear, but we wanted to be clear. We wanted to reiterate that. So option, the fair parking policy approach. Again, some of this brings in some economic signals, which are kind of the most impactful. They're not things that we can require outright, and so it's an optional approach that if you want to not do what some other approaches, this is an approach we allow. So option A sub A is talking about unbundled for residential, for multifamily residential, not townhouses and row houses. Option B, or policy B, is leased commercial developments. That's something that Santa Monica and Seattle do. Option C is what we call now flexible commute benefits, or parking cash out traditionally is what it's called, but flexible commute benefits is more like, hey, your employers are providing something to you. It can be parking, or it can be a cash equivalent. So yeah, that's something that there's some references to in DEQ's eco rule and the eco rule update, the employer commute option rule. Theirs isn't as strong as this, but that's what it is. That's harder for, we've heard, for cities to do. It would require a local ordinance probably, and some sort of notice to your larger employers. Most communities don't have a super lot of employers who are over the 50 number, but that's what it would require. AD is something that our rulemaking advisory committee members asked for. If you can figure out a way to do it and tax your commercial parking lots, that's an option for you. I haven't heard a lot of appetite for that out of local cities, but that's an option for you. And AE is pretty straightforward. It's just saying, hey, new multifamily mandates aren't going to be more than a half space per unit because people are building it anyway, or just because we think we need a lot more multifamily development, we're going to do some other things. So I think AE is probably the most straightforward and easy thing technically for folks to do, if not politically, but technically. So any questions about any of this? Again, we're hoping to pull together some sample language and to provide some more guidance on this, because we do realize this is somewhat out of a lot of land use planners' comfort zone. It's not really the world that we live in, but or the world that we think about a lot. But it is, folks, something that other cities have done.
Evan, this is Peter with the City of Portland. Not a question, but more of an observation. As I look at this, A and E apply to multifamily or residential, which could include multifamily. B and C apply to commercial. And as part of the eco rack we're talking about, and part of the regional mobility policy, we're talking about applications that impact both in VMT per capita and VMT per employee. And so as you go forward, you may want to consider requiring that at least one of the choices is in the residential and at least one of the choices in the commercial, because we got to, if you really want to seriously reduce VMT and make shifts, we're going to have to work on both sides of the ledger, both the residential side and the employment side. There tend to, there are fewer employment trips, but those trips often have more choices. Transit is more frequent usually. And the employment is often located in areas, not always, but in many cases, often located in areas with more choices. So just a thought going forward that you may want to consider a requirement, that not just 3 of the 5, but that one be at least one be on the commercial and one be on the residential. That may end up being the choice, given that you have to choose 3 of 5. And as you said, D is not something that many agencies would do. So for all practical purposes, you may end up with that, but it might be clearer if it was choose one from each at a minimum.
Thanks for that feedback and insight, Peter.
So a question in the chat. Why exempt townhouse or row house in subsection A?
This is something our housing team advised me on. Kevin, do you have insights on this? Or Ethan? Ethan's not with us, I don't think, but Kevin, do you have insights on this?
Yeah, I think this is a recognition that what we think of as townhouse or row house development can actually be multifamily depending on the lotting pattern. And so where you've got basically multiple units on one parcel, that has a different implication than if you have, lots on individual properties with shared walls. And so just the difficulty of implementing this requirement in that context where we can't really define exactly what, whether it is multifamily or individual units, I think is part of what we're trying to get out here. I think the other issue is that the challenge with the way these developments are typically done, if there is a shared parking lot, that's one thing. But typically with a townhome development, you're going to have like individual spaces for each unit. And so in that context, it doesn't necessarily make sense to unbundle parking that is directly immediately adjacent to an individual unit, if that makes sense. I think that's what we're trying to get at. I don't know. Does that sound right to you, Evan?
That certainly reminds me of some of our conversations, so I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So the state does not always define a townhouse row house as only one unit per lot or parcel. Evan?
Yeah, so for the purposes of the middle housing ordinance, these things are defined as a single unit on a single lot, as I recall. So House Bill 2001 did include that definition, but understand that that is not an across the board definition that would apply to any townhome or row house development. It's simply saying that in terms of the middle housing allowances, we're talking an individual unit on an individual lot with shared walls. So it doesn't preclude local governments from doing something, from allowing a townhouse, row house development on a single lot that really is more of, it really is a multifamily development. Does that make sense?
Okay. Mike, Kevin and I are happy to continue this conversation offline if you have additional questions on this. We do have a few more slides to get through, but yeah. But so what the rules say now is that cities and counties can exempt it. It's pretty clear in the language exactly why and all the details we can get into offline. Okay. Option 3, the reduced, sorry. Okay. Option 3 is reduced regulation management approach. It includes a lot of things. So it's kind of beyond the edges of the climate friendly areas. So this is something you would check back in on once you've designated your climate friendly areas. Transit oriented development, mixed use development, group quarters, studio, like more explicitly by use type, studios and 1-bedrooms, and condos. Change of use and redevelopment for buildings that are vacant. City of Detroit, Michigan, not City of Detroit, Oregon, has this provision, and they require folks register their building is vacant, so you can do that. Change of use and redevelopment, expanding existing businesses a little bit. Let me go to the next page and then we'll take some questions. Stuff in historic districts or historic buildings, commercial properties that are smaller. Reach code, lead, schools, bars, taverns. And there's a callback to the parking maximums that if you're a smaller population city, you do have to do those provisions in 415 under this approach. And then designating at least one residential parking district. Again, that's defined in the definitions. So that's what option 3 looks like. Questions on these provisions? And I've appreciated the local cities working through this language and trying to make it cleaner. I know that earlier drafts, it was less clear, so we're trying to, we've clarified some of that.
And we do have another question. Does K apply to residential and commercial?
There's nothing in it that indicates it's limited to a type. So I would read that as yes. If there's an industrial development that's seeking certificate, yeah. That's LEED certified if it's commercial or residential. Okay, not seeing any other questions on those. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, one more on the chat. On the historic property aspect, could you clarify between inventoried properties and locally designated historic properties?
That's not my specialty, so I don't know if any of the other staff can speak to that, or we just need to put that on a get back to you. Okay.
Yeah, I can't pretend to be an expert here. I think this covers, section H seems to cover the field of National Historic District, National Register, or local inventory of historic resources or buildings. So it may be a local district or a local historic, building. May, as I read this, I believe that's how it would apply. Does that answer the question? Oh, let's see. Inventoried and locally designated. I see what you're saying. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, actually, I think we should look into this a little bit in terms of the implication of the term inventoried versus designated resources. So let's, we'll have to get back to you on that one. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. Fabulous. Okay. We're down to our last section of the parking mandates. So we'll circle back with you, Anthony. So 450 is really kind of the only applies to the 6 to 7 cities that are over 100,000. It doesn't apply to counties at those levels, and it kind of asks them to make a decision of, hey, does parking have real value? If so, we should price a little bit of it of the on-street value. And there are 2 steps. The first is to say, all right, we're going to price 5% of it by September 30th, 2023. And the second step is 2 years later, we're going to price 1 out of every 10 on-street spaces. So we've talked to a lot of the cities that this applies to already, so I don't know if people have additional questions on it, but kind of a reminder in 1A that, hey, there's the 420 out. If you don't like this, you can always just, yes, Christina, I appreciate that. We will, the stuff that, anything, yeah, we'll provide that guidance on sub H more broadly on our website. So do 1A, do 1 and 1B is just saying, hey, price at least 10%. The reference down below in the this is the timing and applicability does the 5% and then the step up to 10%. So that's the way it's done. The permanent rule says that has a 10% level, and then the timing and application is the 2-step process. So you can always change your selection. The one thing about this that it's not just saying, hey, there's a $10 a year residential parking permit. That's not demonstrating that parking really has significant value. and that, so we're asking for levels where it's 50 cents a day at least, or 49.3 cents a day if you're doing the $15 per month. So yeah, so that's what that says. Any questions on that?
And Jay has his hand up.
Jay.
Yeah, hey Evan. How like are you guys expecting that cities will just kind of make an estimate of all street parking across the city and then, you know, go from there? Like, I guess, you know, what kinds of expectations do you have about the amount of parking that then is measured for 5 or 10%?
Yeah, we realize that cities don't have good inventories of their on-street parking, or precise inventories of how many spaces you have. We think a good faith estimate is what we're estimating, and then or what we're expecting, and a 5% and 10% of that. So figuring out your on-street parking, we can kind of talk you through how that might be done. It's also something graduate students have often done. It's kind of a fun GIS, or an interesting GIS exercise that you might get some help with from somebody. But yeah, that's that. So yeah, we're not expecting, hey, we've gone out and documented every last parking space. We're expecting it to be a little bit good faith estimates based on some data. But Eunice.
Hi, this is actually Julie, subbing
Julie.
in for Eunice. And I'm sorry, I just came into the webinar version from watching on YouTube, so I might have missed this, but the 5% and the 10%, we've done sort of a GIS level analysis just to see where we might be at. And it's pretty, what's the right word? I would say that if we, priced all of our downtown parking, including our Capitol Mall and our North downtown area, we'd be at about 3% of all of our on-street parking. And if we added all of our RP districts, residential permit parking districts, and we raised the prices of those by, well, more than tenfold from what they are today in order to qualify, we'd be maybe at 6%. So I see this as a pretty unrealistic level. And is this something that you've talked about adjusting downward to be more realistic?
It's so we certainly looked at the percentages, realized that they could be a stretch percentage for some of the cities included in this, and if it's something that if it's the direction you want to head with your parking reform, happy to continue to have that question open with the commission. These dates, as far as when these have to be done, are something that's eligible for alternative dates under the alternative dates proposals. So happy to continue that conversation. Realize they can be stretch percentages for some of the cities, but that's what the commission adopted, and it may be an incentive for City of Salem to choose no parking mandates, because this doesn't apply if you have no parking mandates. So yeah. Okay. We're almost out of time. I do want to do two last things, and I can stay on afterwards. The last thing is the climate friendly area stuff. No one's asking questions about this because you won't have to do this for years. And a lot of this may already be covered by your frequent transit stuff. It may be the same areas overlap, so it may just be really clean. You don't have to do anything under 435. This is for climate friendly areas and the metro equivalents. And it's saying you waive your parking mandates within the area and a quarter mile around it, trying to encourage those areas to expand. If you don't want to waive all your parking mandates, you can do a parking benefit district, reduce your residential mandates, and waive your commercial mandates. So those are kind of the options in those areas under this. Again, this doesn't kick in for a while for the climate friendly area communities. This does kick in more quickly for the metro area equivalents. Any questions about this?
Evan, what is the timing for the metro area?
Metro areas, this would fall under the June 30th of next year. Or when they adopt their regional town centers. There are some areas that have not yet adopted those centers. So when they adopt those centers, that they would have to comply with this.
Got it.
Hey, Evan, can you go back for a second?
Yeah, let me highlight this because I know I want to respect people's time and then go back for a second. I'm available for questions via phone or email. We have some stuff coming up on our website. We're having more office hours. We will probably have more parking related webinars and or office hours. There is some stuff. Make sure that you're signed up for our email updates. That's how you find out about these resources and these events. So I do want to highlight that before people have to jump off at 10:30, so, or 10:32, sorry. Okay, let's go back. Thank you, Cody, in the chat. Okay, question on this.
Yeah, I guess I thought that climate friendly areas were not being, or the metro centers were not being designated as climate friendly areas until Metro tells cities to do that at the end of, their deadline is 2024.
Well, so the non-adopted areas in Metro will tell communities to do that. Yes, and then communities will do that.
Right, but I don't have a designated climate friendly area. And under the rules, the way it's written, it seems to say that, we don't have to do that until Metro tells us to.
Okay, let me take another look on that back forth, talk with Kevin about it. Yeah, it feels that for this sentence that my arrow's at, if you've already adopted this stuff, if you haven't adopted regional or town center, then this other stuff kicks in. But Kevin, you have anything to say?
Yeah, let's see. Shall adopt language. Yep, right. So most of the town and regional centers in Metro have been adopted. Boundaries have been adopted. They've been zoned appropriately. And so I think what Evan was saying is, in that situation, those requirements would apply. When was it? June of next year? Did I get that right? Okay. For those, I think there's 9 town and regional centers that have yet to be adopted. And for those, they would follow that schedule that's laid out in rule, which has Metro applying that requirement in their urban growth management functional plan, I think by December of 24, and then cities would have 1 year after that to actually adopt those centers. And at that point, then for those unadopted centers, these requirements on parking would also apply.
Yeah. So my reading is if you've already adopted them, these apply by next June. But I'll double check that, Jay, and get back to you. Julie.
My question is actually going back to a section in 445.
Yeah, sure. So sorry to interrupt. So everyone, I am planning to stay on for at least until 11 to answer questions as is possible. Cody, are you available to stay on? Okay? Thank you, Cody. Yeah. So other staff may have other responsibilities, but we want to, yeah, go for it, Julie.
So in 445, let's see. sub 1A capital C,
Mhm.
the requirement for employers of 50 or more employees, is that 50 or more employees at a single workplace, or is that, because I think that's the way the DEQ rule is, based on a work site. This doesn't specify, and I'm just wondering, I mean, I'm thinking about, Starbucks or McDonald's or someplace where there may be 50 employees throughout the entire city limits, but not at a singular site. How is that? Does it apply to them?
I don't think the rule language exempts them explicitly because it doesn't say per site. That's just my reading of this rule language. I can talk with our staff internally about whether we think something that limits it per site feels like it's within line with this requirement or not.
Well, or maybe the requirement could be changed, the rule could be adjusted.
Yeah.
I would think it would be important to try to align with what the DEQ, I mean, I know they're still in the rulemaking process, but it was pretty clear that was my understanding from, at least in the past, how they've applied the eco rule.
Yeah, I can talk to Karen over at DEQ as well. And yeah, and maybe this is something we add in the list of potential amendments. So I appreciate
Right.
that.
I'm reading
It was-
C here, and it does say workplace.
Where?
It's the third sentence. Employees at the workplace provide benefit.
Yeah,
Doesn't.
yeah, the workplace doesn't necessarily revise the right part of that sentence. So yeah. So
It was just your comment that there aren't all that many workplaces that would fall up to this level. I think that
Yeah.
if it is employees total, then I think there would actually be quite a lot. And so anyway, that's one question. Then I have a question on D. I was sort of surprised nobody asked questions. You seem to imply that, if you can figure out how to do it, then do it. Yeah, your exact words, I think, were, if you can figure out a way to do it. So is DLCD going to provide guidance or examples on how to do this? Because this is one of the areas where it's totally outside of our realm of, expertise.
I mean, if you have a real interest in that issue, I can do some work on that. So I will do some initial work on that, and then we can continue the conversation if it seems like it's something you want to pursue.
For us at this point, it's presenting options and presenting those choices. And if we really don't know what this means, then it's not a really good way to present an option.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I can go back to my notes from when we worked on this provision in the Rulemaking Advisory Committee and see what I can pull up.
Okay, thank you. An example of where another jurisdiction has done this, even if it's not Oregon, would be helpful. And then understanding how it, maybe, works in Oregon law would also be helpful.
Okay.
Julie, City of Seattle does this, but in Washington, because there's a sales tax, they get the data. This in Oregon, because we don't have a sales tax, would be difficult, not impossible, but you'd have to jump through hoops that you don't have in Washington and California.
Thanks, Peter. Okay. Looking at the chat. Okay. Yes. Okay. Other questions? Okay. we didn't want to invite everyone to a 2-hour webinar because we didn't think anyone could. So happy to run over a few minutes here. We certainly have a decent list of things that we want to do some research on and provide some written responses to. We may hold a parking reform specific office hours, or we may just encourage people to come into these office hours. We may, again, later in the fall, put together something more, because we do realize communities are trying to choose one of those 3 options, even though that decision is not due until the end of next, or the implementing that is not due till the end of next June. So we want to be a resource for you. We want to answer questions and provide examples and other things, and or take suggestions on what maybe we should tweak in the rules as we go forward. If you did not receive the Zoom, the email about these office hours on September 12th, or actually, I don't think you have, because maybe we said save the date. We'll be sending out an email later this week highlighting those office hours and how to sign up for those. Those are for any questions in any of the rules, any of the climate friendly area rules. You can ask Cody a bunch of questions, and Kevin and Bill. The way to get that is to subscribe to our email updates on our website. You just click through a couple of times, and there's a climate friendly equitable communities implementation email list to sign up for. And we're sending out an email every week or two, letting you know what's new and what we have for you. So I think that's pretty much what I had. Any last questions or comments or thoughts? Wonderful. Well, I appreciate having so much interest in parking reform that we busted the technology. Thank you, Cody, for juggling all that on your first day back. It's quite a little fire hose to jump into. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Cody.
Yeah, and we'll work to get the whole meeting that we had recorded put up into the YouTube channel for anyone who missed the first part of that meeting. Apologies on that, but we'll get that up there hopefully later today.
Thanks, Cody. All right. Well, thank you all for your thoughtful questions and working through the implementation on this with us. Nice to see you all and hear your questions and hear what we need to get for you. So thank you. Take care.
Bye.